Now, data from Tanzania's National Statistics Bureau has revealed that food prices are now at 11%, or rather rising at 11% per month. That's months after the government admitted that, yes, there was a drought that was ravaging the country. Inflation overall went up to well over 6%, and that's squeezing the population even harder. President John Magufuli initially asked people to simply, in his words, work harder before the Ministry of Agriculture called for assistance to support 1 million people in Tanzania who are now facing a food shortage. Now, the Statistics Bureau does show that prices have been on an upward trend and things only look set to get a lot worse. Let's dig deep into the details of this particular story. I'm now joined by Lucy Taylor. She's live in Dar es Salaam tonight with more data on this. Lucy, how's Tanzania faring with this drought that's ravaging East Africa? I mean, inflation data suggests that food supply is limited, but what does the output on the ground really look like?
Yes, well, rising food prices are the biggest driver of inflation in Tanzania, and inflation in the food and drink category went up to 11% last month, up from just over 8% the month before. That tallies with what we know, both from the figures about food outputs, but also from what I've seen as I've been driving around farms in Tanzania. The rains that were expected last October and November never came in many regions, and as you travel around, you can see fields of failing crops, fields of dying animals. In some regions, the harvest failed by as much as 50%. The government initially denied there were any food shortages, but since then they have had to concede that there are as many as 1 million Tanzanians going hungry.
Indeed, that's pretty disturbing all around. Now, Tanzania in the good times tends to be an exporter of maize to her neighbours in East Africa, Kenya, for example. But given the surge we're seeing in food prices and, of course, the failed rains last year, should we be expecting a ban on exports?
Well, the government is already restricting exports of primary commodities such as maize, rice and beans because, of course, Tanzania is affected by what's happening in the surrounding areas. And as you know, much of southern Africa and eastern Africa is suffering from food insecurity at the moment. Many countries in those areas are actually struggling for the second or third year in a row.
Indeed. Field trials of genetically modified maize, these were happening sometime late last year as well. Has this drought made Tanzania perhaps a bit more amenable to the idea of switching over to GM corn?
Historically, Tanzania has been strongly opposed to genetically modified crops, and there have been very strict regulations about growing or importing them. They're seen as something of a Western Trojan horse, a way for big companies to break into Africa's farming sector and make serious money by some people. But in recent years, there has been something of a breakthrough. Last year, Tanzania began its first test of GM crops in something called drought-resistant white corn. And that will be monitored over the next 2 to 3 years for safety and effectiveness. So that could be one solution to this problem in the long term. In the short term, though, the solutions for some of Tanzania's farmers are much simpler. Things like better water management systems, because many of the farmers here are too poor even to afford the most basic irrigation systems. So they leave themselves very vulnerable to variations in the weather.
Indeed, and of course the numbers do back that up because only about 4% of Tanzanian farmers do irrigate. One last question for you though. We've seen reports of fall armyworm showing up in Uganda and in Kenya as well. Have these pests been seen in Tanzania too?
Well, there are 2 types of armyworm present in Tanzania at the moment, but they haven't had the devastating effect so far that they've had in other countries, such as in Zimbabwe, for example. They are a kind of moth which spreads very quickly, it's highly destructive, and it does particularly target maize, which is by far the staple crop in Tanzania. So farmers here are on their guard, but they're hoping that the coming months will be kinder to their harvest than the past few months have been.
Indeed, we'll keep an eye on that story. Thank you for that. That's Lucy Taylor, of course, live in Dar es Salaam, Tanzania.